Very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Shantanu Bharadwaj, and I'm the Principal Officer at Way to Wealth Insurance Brokers. I welcome all of you to the second edition of the Way to Wealth BFSI webinar series. We once again have a very diverse audience representing senior management, finance, treasury, and investment management functions. Coming to today's topic, the Indian debt markets have seen a lot of action recently. The purpose of today's webinar is to analyze and demystify some of these factors, like the sharp yield movements, RBI's recent accommodative stand, and also provide some sort of outlook for the future. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Mr. Anurag Mittal, Associate Director, Fund Management, IDFC Asset Management Company. Anurag has over 15 years of experience in the mutual fund and financial services industry. He has been associated with IDFC AMC since November 2015. In his current role, Anurag manages many debt funds, including the IDFC Corporate Bond Fund and IDFC Banking and PSU Debt Fund, which are among the largest funds in their respective categories. Prior to his current assignment, he was associated with various prestigious companies, including HDFC AMC, Axis AMC, and ICICI Prudential Life Insurance, among others. Anurag holds a master's degree in accounting and finance, with specialization in finance from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a bachelor's degree in commerce from India. He is also a certified chartered accountant with the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India. Outside of work, Anurag enjoys traveling and adventure sports. He is an avid runner and has participated in several marathons. Ladies and gentlemen, we will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Request you to post your queries via the chat window during the presentation, and we will take up as many as possible at the end of it. Over to you, Mr. Anurag Mittal.
Thanks, Shantanu, and thanks for a very kind introduction. And thanks everyone for joining in for today's call. So yes, as Shantanu said, so I'll first start with our interest rate outlook and what we feel about the market, and then we will discuss the recent movement in yields, the kind of spreads what making sense, and the kind of strategies which make sense in the current market. So yes, obviously in the last, if we really see how since 2016 how inflation targeting has started, the initial years of RBI under inflation targeting were more or less focused on controlling and managing inflation expectations. In the last year especially, that focus has now shifted from just inflation to also now to support growth. So I think our interest rate outlook also, given that inflation is expected to remain well managed, it depends a lot on how we really assess our growth outlook. And to assess that, I think we, I'll try to take us all through some charts, which will really help us understand the drivers of growth. Just want to understand before I start, am I audible enough? Because earlier there were some issues. So now is it fine? Great. Yeah. So I'll just share some of my thoughts with you. So there is a general theme when we discuss Indian macro, that one is that household consumption is very resilient. We are a domestic and inward-looking economy, and once that lockdown ends, that growth will come back. The second, usually, which goes around, that the current capex or the manufacturing cycle, especially on the private sector, is being held back either because of some policy logjams or because of capacity, or demand issues, and that will also come back once that happens. The third theme is that there is risk aversion, which is leading to issues in the shadow banking or the NBFC sector, and once that risk aversion, which is kind of self-inflicted, that will go away. Even the NBFC sector, issues will resolve. Uh, and the fourth is that the credit spreads, at these absolute low levels, credit spreads are becoming attractive. And is it a right time to enter into, credit-oriented strategies, right? So, so I'll just take us all through this one by one. So the first is, household consumption, and we take it for granted, in the past 15 years, that Indian households are really, any resilient to any domestic or external shocks, and that growth, will keep coming, and this is just a blip. So if we really assess that in the last 15 years how growth has been, if we see and if we divide this growth phase into three phases, which is the phase one, which is the phase of 2003 to 2008, where the global GDP was growing around pretty rapidly. Then was the phase two, which was after the global financial crisis, which is between post 2009. So, and it's actually, I have divided the phases. So between 2009 to 2014, and phase three, which is the 2014 to this date. And if we see the shock to to global GDP post 2008, and how really that household consumption came up, and this chart, if we see, so this chart, this slide represents the total public sector deficit of the government, which is your center plus state plus the PSU borrowing. So if you see this chart from FY08 to FY09, the government expanded fiscal quite massively. In fact, the center's fiscal deficit went from 2.5% to GDP to almost 6% of GDP from FY08 to FY9. What really happened was government, after the Lehman crisis, government implemented a nationwide farm loan waiver. They implemented the sixth pay commission. They, undertook massive MSP as well as rural wage hikes. So if you see, the private final consumption expenditure went all the way from 7.2 to 8.7. So just coming to the next slide, and this slide shows rural wages as well as real rural wages. And on the right hand side, you can see the average MSP hikes. So if you see the left hand side, if you look at the chart between 05 to 08, wages were growing, but they were, if you look at the real rural wages, they were growing between 0 to 5%, and on a nominal level, they were growing between 5 to 10%. But if you look at from 2008 to 2013, these wages grew pretty rapidly, growing between 15 to even 25%. So that was the kind of, because of expansion of NREGA, there was a sudden, spurt in rural wages, and that led to a massive spike in wages. If you see similarly on the MSP side, suddenly from 2009 till 2014, the average MSP hikes were around, if we see, around 15%. So that led to a strong, consumption push among the households, as well as the, whether you look at the pay commission and overall low real rates, that led to a strong urban consumption. Obviously, since we were overheating, it kind of, led to a unsustainable situation in 2013, where RBI had to hike by 300 basis points within a month to control our fiscal current account as well as inflation expectations. So obviously this was unsustainable, and which kind of manifested in 2013. But this was the primary reason because of which consumption continued to grow. Right after 2013-14, if we recall, we moved into we started moving towards the inflation targeting framework. So although the official inflation targeting framework was introduced in 2016, but after 2014 itself, the RBI and the government had started to move. So if you remember Dr. Rajan's initial policy, he started by saying that I have to move to 8% and 6%, and then ultimately we have to go to 4%. So that was the unofficial target before inflation targeting really came into play, that the government and RBI were working on. So if you see, and government has had a large role to play in that. So if you see, Post and in this the left hand side chart, there is a break in the series because of unavailability of data. So we have left that data as it is. But if you see since 2014, there was a substantial drop in rural wages. In fact, real rural wages have become negative since 2019. And similarly, if you look at the right hand side chart, which is the MSP price chart, that also went down pretty substantially. So that also had a huge bearing on how the inflation actually came down. But strangely, after 2014, we had demonetization, we had GST, which were kind of demand shock, especially on the unorganized sector. But yet the consumption did not come down, and the reason behind that consumption, not coming down, is actually on the right hand side chart. If you see in this is the net household financial savings. So if you see this chart, this is the same time at which financial saving households started to basically borrow to consume. So earlier, the consumption which was happening on either jobs growth or income growth, that started to happen post in the phase two via borrowing growth. So that household leverage basically kind of cushioned the demonetization, the GST shock, the fall in MSP and rural wages, and which led to a kind of a feeling in the economy that everything is well and that consumption can continue. And we started to take for granted that we will continue to grow between even 6 to 7%, even if global economy is not doing that well. Also, very interestingly, and I'll explain that in the actually next slide, when we talk about private sector capex and its effect on private sector job growth or its contribution to GDP, so China in terms of its debt dynamics was actually quite similar to India in 2008 2009. So China, as from its debt to GDP, was also about 120%, on a total debt to GDP, which is your private plus households plus government all put together. What it did in 2008 2009 was that it unleashed a huge infrastructure, basically fiscal as well as monetary stimulus, and it went into a huge infrastructure investment. That led to a spurt in both global as well as Chinese GDP growth, led to commodity price inflation, led to food price inflation, led to the tech cycle capex, which we saw in Europe. And as a result of that, so very interestingly, right? So when we see that, usually when we talk about, again, India, we talk about that private sector, or maybe since we are not very big part of export value chain, maybe a private sector capex is also not part of global growth cycle. And if you look at this chart, and this is the sectoral deployment of bank credit, which I have try to demarcate between FY10 to 13, FY14 to 17, and 18 to 20. If you see, most of the credit growth in these industries was actually coming in the sectors which were tied to global cycles. If you see the high credit growth, it was coming in mining, textiles, metals, and even power sector, which was basically to support the increase in capacity in in the mining and metal space. So that's where, so most of our actual private sector capex is not just a function of a domestic growth, but it's actually a function of global growth. So till global growth does not pick up, it's very unlikely that private sector capex can happen, because ultimately private sector capex happens either to increase capacity or to do innovation. So either you have innovating companies like let's say Tesla or Samsung doing something new on the products and doing R&D and capex, or you have companies which are on the supplying chain side to the global trade cycle. So in India, we seem to have companies more on the which are suppliers to global trade cycle, and that's where our, even if you look at FY14 to 17, even when we were doing well on the growth front, even when we were growing at 7%, our private sector was not taking off. And so if the private sector was not taking off, what was really leading to capital formation or capex. And if you look at the right hand side chart, uh, which is the government spending, right? This is where you will see the continuous increase in government expenditure, which was, it was actually the government through both on balance sheet and off balance sheet, which was doing the spending and which was lifting the capex. It was not the private sector. So if you, coming back to the first slide, right, if you see the total public sector deficit, it actually didn't really come down. So it went up in FY09, it came down by FY11, but it continued to remain at that range about 8.5 to 9%, as the government was basically kind of replaced the private sector capex and continued to spend. So when we say that, you know, government is not doing enough, actually government was doing quite, you know, whatever they could do within their constraints to undertake that capex. So that 7% growth that we saw was, one, because of household leverage, second, because of government replacing the private sector capex. Also, if you look at the bottom chart, it actually, you know, our growth outlook, and this is China's nominal and China's real GDP. And if you look at our private sector, you know, capex, that actually quite correlates well with how the Chinese, you know, growth was performing and what really happened in 2014-15. And if you recall, oil prices fell quite sharply. Some of us, you know, we believe that it's because of shale. It was not just because of shale gas, you know, coming on stream. If you remember, even other hard commodities fell quite sharply. It was because China started to reorient its economy from a manufacturing or an export-led to a consumption-led model. And that was when we had the fall in global GDP. That was when we had the fall in the the private sector capex. So basically, private sector capex is not really a function, not just a function of, you know, either bank credit or it's a function of domestic demand alone. It's also a huge function of global growth. And as we are seeing right now, you know, whether you look at any factors, whether it's China or any other you know, market, it's very unlikely that we are likely to see again a spurt in growth in any of these economies, whether you look at US, Europe, or China. So, you know, people tend to blame US-China trade tensions. But as you can see from the chart, you know, China had started to slow down well before even, you know, when President Trump took office, even when US-China trade tensions started to, you know, happen, because China ultimately realized that there is only, you know, to a limit that you can grow as an export-led or as a manufacturing-led economy. Beyond a point, the return on that investment is actually even lower than the cost of debt that you do to sustain that. So it had started to become unsustainable, and that's why China changed its track. And that's where we have seen the continuous decline in Chinese as well as, you know, global growth. 2016 was an exception because when President Trump took office, they announced a huge fiscal stimulus as well as a dollar repatriation bill, which led to a certain, you know, 1.5 year kind of a growth, which was off the run. But the usual trend line of global growth, you would see, has been quite weak. The third point, you know, that we want to discuss is that if we see, you know, one of the reasons we discussed why household consumption held up so strongly was, you know, increase in leverage. So where did that leverage really come from? And also, I discussed in my initial remarks that there you know, there's a perception in some circles that there's a risk aversion among, you know, investors, and once that risk aversion goes, that will also, you know, the NBFC or the shadow banking sector will also recover. So this is, this slide, you know, represents the top 41 private sector NBFCs and HFCs, their loan book basically. And if you see, you know, these, and they represent about 85% of total balance sheet of the total NBFC sector, right? So if you just see from FY13 to FY19, uh, this sector has grown from a total size of 7 lakh crores to 21 lakh crores in just 6 years. Just to put it in perspective, if I remember correctly, I think Kotak Bank's balance sheet would be somewhere around 2.2, 2.4 lakh crores. So basically, the NBFC sector added equivalent of 6 Kotak banks in 6 years. That is the kind of growth the NBFC sector saw. And if you see the breakup of this loan book, it was mostly retail, SME led, and real estate led. Right? You see the breakup, it's about 20% is in SME and LAP, about 20% again is on the real estate side, on the wholesale side. So the risk aversion actually is not coming that borrowers, and what's really happening, everyone was happy to participate in the NBFC. So after demonetization, basically, when AAA yields, went down, similar to what's happening right now, when AAA yields went down, everyone wanted to earn better. Everyone, wanted to get into higher carry trades. That's when, if you see the flows from mutual funds to these NBFCs, even flows from banking sector to these NBFCs really went up, because what really happened that time, many of the banks after 2013 telecom issues, coal mining issues went under PCA. So what really happened was there was a perception in the market that maybe banks cannot do lending that efficiently, maybe NBFCs can. So let's support these NBFCs which can do much more efficient lending. So there was a lot of spurt of capital to these NBFCs, and that's what the loan book has shaped up in 6 years. So why it really stopped? It wouldn't have stopped if ILFS default wouldn't have happened. So that was not a deterioration in loan book. Actually, that was a corporate governance issue. As now we are realizing that there was some issues in the balance sheet, and it's not that some assets went bad. There was some mismanagement issues that are being alleged in the court. So basically, after ILFS, investors realized that they have to look at the asset side of the NBFCs. They have to look at the ALM of these NBFCs, and that's where loans to these lower rated NBFCs stopped. That's where you would see the consumption cycle also taking a break, because the loans which were given on the retail, SME, real estate side, that also stopped because the focus of the investors as well as focus of those NBFCs became more quality conscious. Right? So that is the time, if you remember, post 2019 itself, it is when you will see the indicators, which is CV sales, auto sales, two-wheeler sales, they had started to slow down. It was not because of anything else, but because leverage, one, the household leverage was becoming unsustainable. Secondly, you would see investors, the NBFC started to focus on more secured lending. So, coming back to the current situation, so I tried to, explain the situation between phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, and now we are in phase 3. So what I'm really trying to say that if you look at the, GDP equation, it's consumption plus investment plus government spending plus export minus import, really, right? So typically, like I said, the consumption cycle looks quite broken. It will take some time for that consumption cycle to come up, especially in times of economic uncertainty. Even if you give tax cuts or any other incentive to consumers or households, we have seen globally as well as historically that typically at those times consumers tend to save rather than to spend until they have certainty on their jobs or till they have certainty on growth. So till that come, that consumption cycle is really unlikely to pick up. The second point, the health of financial households. If let's say the households were at a position where they were in 2009, that is, they had the capacity to lever up, they could have levered and spent. Unfortunately, that capacity also has been kind of come down in the last 5-6 years. So they can not also lever up. So you have a period where you are not really seeing any pickup in consumption till you see strong job growth. On the investment growth, like I explained, it's very less that the private sector can do till really global economy picks up. So I'm talking all about once the lockdown is over, once things are back to normal. So even if once things are back to normal, we really do not anticipate aggressive private sector capex till really global economy. We see a pickup in global economy, which looks very unlikely as of now. I mean, there will be some pent up demand, but I'm talking about a more sustainable 3 to 5 year kind of a cycle. We really do not anticipate that. The third part being government spending. Like I explained, the government has actually been, running on quite a very, high engine. It's kind of trying, it's from its, if you look at the, again, I'm going back to the first slide, if you look at the combine all the three deficits, it's already at its financial, crisis levels in the last 3 years. The fourth, the second problem, what's happened on the government spending side, is that unfortunately the introduction of GST has actually led to a decline in tax buoyancy. So what we did as an analysis was we tried to see the tax buoyancy before GST. So what we did was we tracked down the growth in indirect tax collection from March 2010 to June 17, which was when GST was introduced, and post June 17 to this date. And what we saw that tax buoyancy actually, from pre-GST to GST fell from 1.5 to 0.3. So basically, and what I mean by tax buoyancy is for every 1% increase in GDP, the percentage increase in indirect taxes. So what 1.5 tax buoyancy means is that if GDP grows by 1%, the tax growth will grow by 1.5%. So which used to be 1.5%, now post GST has actually come to 0.3%. So government really does not have too much of levers to pull to bring about really meaningful capex or meaningful fiscal stimulus. The second problem which we have to appreciate is that if you see, most of the aggressive fiscal stimulus has come from advanced economies, which have the exorbitant, privilege, as economists say, or basically who print the reserve currencies of the world. So whether it's the Eurozone or Japan or the US, they print the reserve currencies of the world, and hence they have that capacity, and markets are quite liberal when it comes to them, that they can print as much as they want and they can really get away with it, which unfortunately emerging markets like India cannot. So India does not have unlimited fiscal firepower to spend and come out of this decline like other countries can do. So basically what I'm trying to say is that in this kind of situation, as most of the private sector economists are estimating, we are likely to see a double-digit decline in growth in terms of real GDP for this year. So next year we might have a, just on the base effect, we might have a, pent-up demand, or you can call it that just because of base, you will see a sharp spurt in growth, but that's really unlikely to sustain in the near future from a long-term or even a short-term horizon perspective. So what it really means for the, ultimately, what does it really mean from a rate perspective? What it means from a rate perspective is that RBI, we usually, when we give views on interest rates, we talk of RBI policy and how many rate cuts are expected. So if you really see the construct right now, today the repo rate is at 4%, the reverse repo rate is at 335, and yet the overnight rate is at 3%. So we believe that there is the marginal utility of rate cuts is not really material for the economy. What has RBI really done, and why there is such a substantial difference between overnight and repo rate? That is because RBI has been keeping liquidity abundantly surplus. Right now we are staring at a headline liquidity surplus of 6 lakh crores. So what we really expect RBI, while we do not really expect aggressive rate cuts from RBI from here on, we expect RBI to keep liquidity surplus and to, keep rates low for an extended period of time till we see a sustainable pickup in growth. So, what are the options for investors in these times? So I'll start with, first thing first, typically what we, see and why, so ideally, I wanted to bring, credit spreads, and I wanted to show a double A to triple A or a double A, single A to triple A chart, but I did not do that intentionally. The problem with double A or single A is that it's not a homogeneous asset class as triple A is, right? So I'll give you examples. Today in the double A segment, we have a metals and mining company, which is promoted by one of the strongest blue chip industrial groups, and which is trading a 2-year double A, metal company. It's an aluminum company. It's trading at 575. There is another metals and mining company, double A, which is trading at 13%. So the same sector, same rating, there is such a big disparity in the valuations of those bonds. So when I give you that perspective, I will not be able to give you a true picture when I give you a double A. Same way for housing finance. There is a double A housing finance company which is trading at 14%. There is a double A housing finance company which is trading at 8%. And what happens when we see those triple A to double A spreads is usually the deterioration that we see in those double A entities. So basically the entities which were trading at 9% and which are now trading at 14%, that is the spread widening that we see. But more importantly, what I wanted really to bring about is that when we compare triple A to double A, they are actually not two same asset classes. These are totally two different asset classes. So what does really, how does AAA asset perform? A AAA asset performs well in a period of declining interest rates. When growth is weak, when inflation is low, interest rates are going low, that is when AAA does well, or a sovereign asset does well. So it's a counter-cyclical asset. Whereas a high yield asset, imagine a real estate company, imagine a loan against shares, asset, imagine a metals and mining company. These all companies will do well when growth is doing well. So a AAA to AA spread is actually only an indicator of risk aversion in the system. It doesn't mean that it at all points in time that it will mean revert. And like I explained, the growth outlook is so weak right now for India as well as for the world. It's absolutely not the right time to enter into credits, whether it is selective credits, mispriced credits, or you can call them by whatever name, but it's absolutely not the right time to enter. If anyone tells you that, okay, I'm looking at credits, do ask them their view. Are they expecting strong growth from here on, or they are expecting weak growth? In case they're expecting weaker growth from here on, they cannot be investing in any credit-oriented strategies. The second false, signal which sometimes get generated in these times is that, okay, absolute level, a AAA fund today is at 5.5. So let's not look at a 10 or a 11% asset. Maybe let's look at a 7.5% asset. Again, so we have to be very mindful of the spreads. If you remember, again go back to ILFS and Dewan, they were just trading 200 basis over their comparable asset. So ILFS was trading about 200 basis over the next AAA, let's say PFC. But Dewan Housing, because it's public information now, was trading 200 to 250 basis over a AAA HFC. So when we say that, okay, let me look at a 7.5% kind of risk, I'm actually looking at a ILFS Dewan kind of a risk. So that is something which we have to be mindful of. We should not just look at, okay, that's, I'm getting a 7.5%, 8% kind of asset. But we are basically seeing that despite these ridiculously low levels, we are getting an asset of 8%. So what's wrong in that? So that is something which we have to really question. So usually what we do is, how we work with clients is that we follow this broadly, this asset allocation framework, and which has served us quite well. So if you look at the broad framework, which is one, you have a liquidity bucket, you have a core bucket, and you have a satellite bucket. Liquidity, as it explains, is very short-term liquidity which can be met by investing in a overnight or a liquid fund, and then you have a core and satellite, right? So a core bucket. So usually the questions that I ask investors when I explain to them, especially at the retail side, is that, let's say if you were getting a State Bank of India fixed deposit at 7%, will you really look at mutual funds? Will you care about core inflation? Will you care about fiscal deficit? Will you care about the shape of the yield curve? Or will you prefer investing in State Bank of India fixed deposit? The usual answer is State Bank of India fixed deposit. The point is, investors prefer fixed deposits. And why they prefer is that it controls for both duration and credit risk. So the core allocation of a portfolio has to mirror that bucket has to control as much as possible in the mutual fund format for both duration and credit risk. That means a portfolio which is without any credit strategy, which has a limited duration profile. So what makes sense? The usual products which make sense in this bucket are your high quality, low duration money market funds, your short-term funds, or your roll down strategies. In fact, roll down AAA roll down strategy mimics that fixed deposit investor and works for them in a perfect sense, because that's what it gives them a certain visibility at the end of the roll down period. And then how we try to bifurcate satellite is between credit and duration. So just like and duration, basically when I say it's dynamic gilt and income funds, which is basically when I go up the yield curve, or I actively manage my portfolio to generate alpha from duration, or I go down the credit curve in terms of a credit oriented strategy to generate that extra alpha. And what happened in the last 4 years, that this core bucket got mixed with this satellite bucket. A lot of investors who were looking for a visible, predictable return to generate that extra return got mixed into this credit bucket, which was actually not core, but satellites or alpha strategy. The only difference is in a dynamic or a gilt fund, because it's mark to market, it's traded actively, we get daily volatility. In credit, that volatility comes in usually 2 to 3 years, but it comes. And that's why we have tried to kind of divide these strategies into 2 buckets. And how does basically investor play out the rate strategy right now? And that's why I've tried to see the yield curve right now. So this blue line is the yield curve as it stands right now. The amber line is the yield curve how it was in month of April. So if you see, we have seen a sharp move, especially if you look at from 3 years. So a 3-year AAA was trading around 6 quarter in the month of April, which is now trading around 5 quarter. A 1-year AAA was trading around 6%, which has now come to 4 quarters. So we have seen a 100 to 150 basis move in the 1 to 4 year segment. And if you look at 10-year AAA, which was around 7 quarter, now it's trading around 6. So there's a 75 basis reduction on the 10-year curve. So what, how should investor play this rate cycle? So like I explained, this cycle now cannot be played tactically. This cycle cannot be played in expectations of meaningful rate cuts from RBI. What it really means is the investor has to pick and extract value from the curve. What it means is, today in a period of surplus liquidity, what we are seeing is that liquid fund returns are even lower than the reverse repo rate. So if you see the last 2-3 months returns of liquid funds, they are even lower than your 335, which is the reverse repo rate. So what it means is that investor has to be more, certain of their investment horizon. If they have a 3 to 6 month horizon, they can still look at a good quality ultra short or a low duration fund, or up to even 1 year they can look at a low duration fund. And why this curve? Sorry, I actually went a little ahead. Coming back to this yield curve, and why this yield curve is so steep. The reason behind the steepness of this yield curve is ultimately investors of the market, they expect that growth will come back within the next 2 to 3 years. RBI will kind of uh, remove all this surplus liquidity. We will go back to a neutral liquidity framework. A rate hike cycle maybe in 2 to 3 years will start. So that uncertainty premium is affecting the 5 to 10 year bond curve. And I'll explain with the help of an example. So today, like I said, a 3-year AAA PSU is trading at 5 quarter, and a 10-year AAA PSU is trading at 670. So in very, very simple terms, you are earning 1.5 rupees for holding a 10-year bond every year. So assume you hold this bond for next 2 years. Again, on a simplistic basis, you earn 3 rupees extra compared to, let's say, if you were just holding a 3-year bond. What happens after 2 years? Let's say, just the liquidity goes back to neutral, which is the effective overnight rate goes from 3% to 4%. And RBI starts to change their stance. Even if they, let's say, assume a spike of 75 basis in yield, a 3-year bond at that point in time will remain just a 1-year bond. You will have assuming a mod duration of 1, you will have a 75 paisa MTM loss. A 10-year bond, which will be a 7-year bond at that point in time, will still have a mod of around 4.7, and a 0.75 move at that point of time. That means around a $3 loss. So you kind of lost the same that you earned in the next 2 years, and that's what the risk reward of that is impacting the this yield curve. So what we think is really the sweet spot is between the 3 to 5 year space, or even the 3-year space. Because if you look at today, the 1 year or a 2-year segment is around 4.5. So if you are looking at a 3-year curve today and just compare it with 1 year, you get to make around $1 to $1.50 every year that you hold this 3-year bond. By the time interest rates start to go up, right, that is the time when you will be coming up for repricing. So you kind of ride out the steepness, you capture the steepness, and when the interest rates start to rise, you are, your money is, the maturity of your bond is closer to zero. So what really makes sense in this kind of environment, if someone has a 2 to 3 year kind of horizon, a roll down strategy makes more sense, especially if, so if you're looking for a 2-year kind of a horizon, a 2-year roll down strategy. If you're looking from a 3-year horizon, a 3-year roll down kind of strategy makes more sense in this kind of setup. Because after 3 years, let's say the interest rates start to go up, all that extra carry that you get in a 10-year kind of a space, that gets nullified. Obviously, on the dynamic yield funds, people who are looking at those kind of categories, because they're actively rebalanced over a period of time, obviously investors have been able to make more returns than short term, but that's over a long period of time. There could be considerable volatility going ahead, and that's why we are recommending investors that to only allocate a small portion of their investments in let's say gilt or dynamic oriented strategies. And even if you look at this is the 5-year AAA versus 1-month OIS spread. I did not take the repo spread because actually the repo rate is not really the effective rate right now, and that's why I took this. And if you see, even from a historical spread perspective, it's actually not really hugely overvalued. It's been around these levels. Obviously, the spike that you see in March, April during this was more or less because of that sudden lockdown and certain illiquidity in market, but overall this is still attractive level to enter. And if you look at spread of SDL over G-Sec, this is a slightly dated chart. This shows the 45 basis. Now it's moved more to 60 basis, the 10-year SDL over 10-year G-Sec spread. The only thing to be mindful of when we are looking at 10-year SDL over G-Sec, historically, SDL borrowing as percentage of government center borrowing has been around 65 to 70%. In the last 2-3 years, that borrowing has gone to 80%. And even this year is expected to go up because of shortfall in state collections. So what it means is that these historical spreads do not have any meaning as much. So the current situation is very different. These spreads can continue to go up even in the near future. So we think that as of now, from a risk reward perspective, that SDL to G-Sec spread, given that most of the borrowing on the state side is yet to happen, these spreads can widen even from here on. So, but that's a current situation. Obviously, that situation can change as we go ahead. So that was it from my side. Now we can open up for questions.
Thank you, Anurag. Very enlightening presentation. I request my senior colleague Sridhar to please take up the Q&A, and also request participants to post their questions on the group chat.
Thank you, Mr. Mittal, for a very informative and talk on the debt markets, which is, I think, is a requirement for the day. Because there have been a lot of confusion within the distributor community or the investor community, even at a lot of treasuries, because people are not able to digest the sudden changes which are happening in the debt market vis-a-vis, you rightly pointed out, the April scenario and the May scenario compared to what it is now. So I'll just take up the questions, post that I have a few which I would like to post to you. So just give me a time. This is a question from Tanuj Gupta. What is your view on increase in borrowing in the second half borrowing calendar, and how do you expect to get it absorbed vis-a-vis 10-year benchmark yields? Do you think RBI has ammunition left to support extra borrowing now after HTM hike announced already?
That's a very good, actually doubt which is going in everyone's mind. But given the track record of the government and how and even if you look at how they managed the borrowing last year, what they try to do is they try to optimize it to the last minute. And if you look at the recent comments, also what they have said is that they will try not to borrow extra, and they will try to wrap up their borrowing by December end or first week of Jan, so that states can borrow, because states are still left with about 70% of their borrowing. So what I'm trying to say is that there is there is a possibility that the H2 borrowing calendar might not be changed from the 12 lakh crores gross borrowing that the government announced, and the government might take the call at the end of the calendar year, depending on their improvement in revenue collections. So obviously there is a big hole. We all know that, but there are also some mitigants. So there are 2-3 things. If you remember, the government in its budget had assumed a cash balance or a cash buildup of approximately 60,000 crores, if I remember correctly. So government has an option not to build up that cash balance. So that cash balance is also being built up by borrowing. So it government can not avail of that cash balance and not borrow that. Secondly, the government has also announced a 30,000 crores buyback of bonds of maturing within the next 2-3 years, which obviously given the unprecedented situation, they don't need to do that. So that 1 lakh crores can be saved from there. Thirdly, they also have the option to borrow extra from T-bills. So if the government and RBI believes that this is a temporary situation and by next year tax revenue could normalize, they have the option to borrow more through 1-year T-bills. So if they do that, they might not be required to borrow extra from market, or if the revenue shortfall is even higher than after using all these resources, government might have to borrow extra. But we think, see, if RBI, if you look at Indonesia, if you look at Singapore, many other banks, central banks are now directly monetizing the deficit. That is, that borrowing is not coming to the market, but is being directly placed with the central bank. So if that happens, obviously there is less impact on the market. Market will be supported because of that. But like you said, this will remain an overhang till they announce. So market will keep on looking at the tax collection, will keep on looking, how states are doing, what other sources government is using through T-bills, etc., to borrow, because so this will remain an overhang unless and until RBI does some aggressive action like direct bond placement or through aggressive OMOs. So that is two things which RBI can do to keep yields in check. But till then, you're right, this will remain a concern, and yields, especially on the long end, will remain range bound. Like I said, a lot of state borrowing is yet to come. And that is also pretty much in the belly, between the 8 to 14 year segment. So you have a lot of supply coming up from state as well as center. So you might not see a prolonged rally unless and until you see very, very aggressive action from RBI in terms of direct OMOs.
Thank you, Mr. Mittal. The next question is from Bala. Despite the recent OMOs, 577 GSEC is trading at 605 yield. Will GSEC touch 7% in short term?
Usually, when traders or any market participants or even portfolio managers give any range, it's usually as a reference point to the current levels, right? So if you remember in 2018 September, just post ILFS, there was a big panic in market and 10-year had touched 8%. And if you had asked anyone at that point in time, people would have said, yeah, maybe it can go to 770. When it does 770, people said, yeah, maybe it can go to 7.5. But at 7/4, I'll exit everything, I'll sell everything, and I'll just move away. When it does 7/4, people said, no, maybe it can go to 7 and now 675. So these numbers are just basically reference points to the current market levels. So I would not really like to speculate where 10-year can go. But more importantly, like I said, so far, if you even look at today, RBI actually accepted only 30 crores in GSEC auction, and the rest of the supply in 10-year it devolved on the market. So some sections of market are taking it as a yield signal that it is not comfortable beyond 602. So it devolved the auction today at 602. But point being that RBI has repeatedly said whenever it has announced measures, whether you look at governor, that it's battle ready, and they understand that the borrowing of both center and state is humongous this year, and they will do everything to make sure it's smooth. So it doesn't mean that there will be huge rally in bond markets. I mean, there could be, but it doesn't mean from RBI standpoint as of now. What it means is that RBI will try to intervene at every level to make sure that the excess duration from the market is taken away and bond yields remain well behaved. I mean, just to so today a 10-year a 20-year home loan rate is at 7%, right? So if a 10-year GSEC becomes 7%, that home loan rate ultimately will also go up. So you can't have a situation on one side when you want to bring down borrowing yields of corporates as well as households. At the same time, the the most risk-free asset trading at the same level. So we think RBI understands that. So if you listen to RBI governor's interviews since March, they have consistently talked about impact of bond yields on corporate bonds, impact of bond yields on bank loans. So I think they understand that, and especially in an economy which is degrowing at 10% or 12%, right? You can't have a borrowing cost, let's say, of a home loan back to 8.5%, 9%. So we think that RBI will try to do whatever it takes, and especially given that we are mostly locally owned. RBI still has a lot of levers to pull to control the bond yields.
Thank you. The next question is from Hitesh Bhatia. How do we as individuals identify a good fund? How we find AAA rated safe instruments or a government backed security? I think that
the question
is slightly confusing, whether because it talks about how do we identify a good fund,
right?
And then how we find AAA rated safe instruments or a government backed security. I think the question might be to know which fund is holding these kind of instruments. So maybe something related to that kind of.
So yeah, so I'll give you, usually I tell investors the most simple way is to look at the YTMs of those funds of the category. Look at the average YTM of the category and compare the higher yielding ones. So for example, I'll give you, so today a good quality low duration fund, if you look at the YTM, is somewhere between 390 to 4 quarter, right? So if a low duration fund is giving you a YTM of 475 or 5%, imagine that 20% of that portfolio, right, would be at least 300 basis higher than the 100% AAA portfolio to give a YTM of 50 to 60%, 60 basis, right? Because like 20% into the 300 basis is your 50, 60 basis points. So basically, whatever category that you are looking, so let's say if you're looking at a banking PSU, so if a banking PSU typical average that you see is between 5 to 5 quarter and some fund is giving 575, you can open that portfolio. You can speak to your RM, you can look at the fact sheet that, okay, what are the names that this fund is holding, which is giving them the, yield kicker. So usually what happens in many of the strategies, so one, there is obviously the credit oriented strategy where you can, look at it very clearly. In other funds, usually 70 to 80% of the portfolio is common. The YTM differential comes only from that, usually that 20 to 50%. So whenever you see an outlier in terms of YTM, that is your, should be your first query that, okay, let me see this portfolio. Why is this portfolio yielding, so high on this average? So the usual thumb rule you can look at is 8 to 10% more YTM than the category average. So let's say if the category average is 4%, if any fund is giving more than 440, you can, that's just one of the simple, simplistic examples that I use. The second, especially when looking at, liquid ultra short money market, because a lot of, easy money or short-term money goes there, then actually that's one of the biggest risks, I see in that category, because typically that investor, invest in that either for a SWP or some short-term parking. And what happens is all the papers that you see in money market space are A1+. So you don't, a real estate company, which is single A rated, is also A1+ sometimes. A AA metals company is also A1+, and a PSU also A1+. So how we usually tell investors is that get the long-term rating from whichever fund you want to invest, get the long-term rating of that fund. So let's say if you want to invest in a liquid fund or a money market fund, ask the long-term rating of that paper. So if the long-term rating, let's say, so we have seen instances where the long-term rating has been quite different, than what people thought out to be. So that's also good, one way to look at various schemes.
The next question is from Anshu Rastogi. How to know whether a debt fund is accrual type or capital gain type? In current scenario, a conservative investor investing in AAA bonds, what should be the time horizon, fund style, and return expected?
Sure. So I think the first part I already answered, like when I said that one can look at outliers in terms of YTM, in terms of what the return expectations. So today are let's say roll down strategies make more sense, because like I said, if you expect that interest rates will reverse in the next 2-3 years, that is the time when the roll down will also complete their life cycle. In simple words, I mean, for listeners who don't know what a roll down strategy is, a roll down strategy is basically where there is a target maturity date in a fund, and the fund collapses the maturity to zero by that target maturity, just like in a FMP. So let's say there's a three-year roll down. So every month the maturity of that fund will keep on coming down until it reaches close to zero. So that is the strategy which makes most sense in this current kind of context. So if someone is looking, let's say, a 6 months to 1 year kind of investment horizon, obviously, right now, to be honest, I don't think there are too many roll down strategies. One can look at a low duration or a money market fund. If someone has a 2-year horizon, one can look at a 2-year roll down strategies. There are enough strategies available right now in the market. If someone has a 3-year horizon, one can look at a 3.5 year kind of a strategy on the roll down basis. Like I said, a 2-year AAA right now is yielding between 475 to 5.25. So the return expectations should be anchored from those levels.
Thank you. The next question is from Rachna Makhija. When do you expect the interest cycle to reverse in future? What would be the lead indicators for the same?
That's a good question. So I think we expect the interest rate cycle to reverse maybe when RBI sees a sustainable, growth path. So if you remember our potential rate of growth, before the global financial crisis, the expectation was that India can grow between 7 to 8% without any hiccup. Academically, basically the potential rate of growth is the rate of growth which you can grow without attracting inflation. So before the financial crisis, it was some people estimated it was 7 to 8%. After the crisis, it was estimated at between 6.5 to 7%. Now it's even lower than that. But point being that till you see a sustainable path of, let's say, between 5.5 to 6.5 kind of growth on a real GDP basis, it's very difficult to envisage a rate hike cycle. What are the leading indicators? The leading indicators would be strong rise in consumption, your import pickup, non-oil, non-gold imports picking up, your global trade picking up, your bank credit picking up. So if you look at the credit deposit ratio today, it's one of the lowest we have seen. So till you see credit growth in the economy, whether from corporates or households or anyone, till that you can safely assume that we are still in a slow growth kind of a scenario. That is something which which will give you a good sense of how growth is likely to be. It's also important to understand the sequencing of how the cycle reversal could be. So right now, if you see, we are at a 6.5 lakh crores liquidity surplus. So I don't think RBI can really hike without first absorbing the liquidity. So maybe when the reversal starts, the first step will be liquidity reversal, or it could be a stance change. So right now we are in a accommodative stance. Maybe RBI could move into a stance change without touching interest rates. Maybe they could first absorb the liquidity and make the effective rate from 3% to 4%. That's a straight away 100 basis hike. So they actually don't have to touch headline rates. They just have to move the liquidity needle. So the actual, you know, change in headline rates is still some time away as of now.
Thank you. The next question is from Anshu Rastogi. Can you tell some funds with a roll down strategy in PSU and corporate bond fund space?
Yes, so I can tell about my fund. So we have a fund called IDFC Banking and PSU, which is a 100% AAA as of now, and it has a target maturity of between Jan to March 23. So its maturity will go down to zero between the months of Jan to March 23. So if someone is looking at a 2-year kind of a horizon with a good quality portfolio, they can look at IDFC Banking and PSU. If someone is looking at a 3-year kind of a horizon, then we can recommend IDFC Corporate Bond Fund, which is a 3.5-year roll down strategy. So there, the roll down will end between Jan to March 24. Why I don't give a specific month and why I give a quarter is because that is the time when we will rebalance the fund according to a strategy which makes most sense at that point in time. That is also the time when most of the corporate borrowing happens. So the rebalancing will start somewhere between that quarter. So the roll down should be considered rather than a specific point in time between that quarter. So from a simple standpoint, there's a banking PSU which is a 2.5-year roll down, and a corporate bond fund which is a 3.5-year roll down.
Thank you. The next question is, can RBI come up with rate cuts in future?
So RBI has indicated that there is policy space. So if you read the August policy as well as August minutes of the policy, RBI, including Governor Das, has said that there is a space for further policy rate cuts, but they are waiting for inflation to come down. So I think as and when inflation comes down more towards that 4% range, there is a possibility of cuts. But like I explained, we are already at 3%, and the 10-year GSEC, like we all saw, is at 6.05. So whether the interest rate is 2.75 or 3, it will not really materially change. What matters more for the market is RBI's intervention.
This is the last question. Do you advise to long interest rate for corporates in CP and bond, even though they are running treasury surplus?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the question.
Do you advise long interest rate for corporates in CP and bond, even though they are running treasury surplus? Or is it for, do you advise corporates to borrow in CP and bonds, or against a long-term?
Mr. Sridhar, allow me to ask. Good evening, Mr. Mittal. My question is, do you advise the corporates to block and lock the interest rate in the form of CP and bond, even though they are running the treasury surplus? And if yes, what is the ideal tenure to lock up to 3-year, 5-year? It can be locked for longer period as well.
Sir, I can see, sir, to be honest, this is beyond my remit slightly, because every corporate has its own outlook on their capex cycle, on their working capital needs. So obviously corporates who are just borrowing for 3 to 6 months visibility, they are likely to borrow in CPs, and who maybe foresee capex coming along in 2-3 years might like to borrow in long-term bonds. I'll just give you the levels right now, which will maybe help you decide. A good quality CP, let's say a 6-month CP right now is trading between 360 to 390. A 1-year CP, good quality manufacturing CP, is trading between 4 to 4.5. A 3-year manufacturing bond is trading between 575 to 6.5. So they have to decide where their MCLR is, what their cash flows are likely to be, what is the return that they can make. So let's say if someone is in raising 1 year CP, but he thinks that that money will remain unutilized for 3 months, that they have to take a call whether that makes sense or not, depending on the MCLR. That is the calculation which that particular corporate has to do. I can only give you indicative levels which they can borrow.
I have one more question. This question is with respect to CP and NCD, where the underlying portfolio is under supply chain finance related products. So just wanted to understand the view of yours as a fund manager, how you're looking at investing such paper where underlying portfolio is under supply chain financing papers.
So by supply chain, so you are asking me a specific sector question?
It's a generic. Like a lot of NBFC and bank are lending in a supply chain financing product like a factoring, reverse factoring, vendor finance program, dealer finance. Now they start converting that into a PTC, a CP, and a bond.
Right.
Like Centrum Finance has done it, and there are 2-3 more NBFC has done that kind of a structure. So wanted to hear your view as investor of this paper.
So usually when markets look at a bond, so one is obviously the underlying nature of where the end use of that funding is going towards that NBFC. The second one, we look at any NBFC, it's usually we actually look at how we used to even look at 5 years back, is how diversified that portfolio is, what is the strength of the promoter. Because if you see in the last 2-3 years, right, especially the strength of the promoter group, the ALM profile, that liability profile, whether it's just mutual fund oriented or capital market oriented or it's bank oriented, that has really helped the NBFC. So I will not be able to answer that, okay, if the NBFC, let's say 20% of portfolio is towards supply chain, how will that help? Because I need to understand where the balance portfolio also is, right? Where the other 80% of the portfolio is, what is the strength of the promoter, how is the corporate governance, what is the resource profile. So a lot of factors also go other than just one particular sub-segment, right? If I'm able to understand and explain your question correctly.
Yes.
So we just don't look at a specific sub-segment of any NBFC or of a bank. We usually look at the overall as a whole, that what is the shock absorbing capacity of that NBFC in a stress situation, whether from a liability side or from the asset side. And let's say any of these shock walls fail, what is the strength of the promoter to provide that additional capital in that sense? So that's something which we usually look at.
I think there is one last question, which is on what is your view on perpetual bonds? This is a question from Ashish Gaikwad. So I would add a few things into that. Again, the perpetual bonds have come in vogue, especially the A-rated PSU banks. So, and that is, I think, mostly being sold at the wealth offices, and there are people who are chasing, saying that I am getting in the same bank a 5% or a 5.25% on fixed deposit, whereas the perpetual is coming at 7.5%, 8.5% kind of thing. So would it be advisable for an investor to look only on that kind of factor, or they should consider something else also?
Just like I said, see, just like a AA paper and a AAA paper is not a same asset class, even though both are bonds. Similarly, a bond of let's say a tier 2 bond of a bank and a tier 1 bond of a bank is not the same asset class. Like, yes, learned the hard way. It's a quasi equity, right? And especially in Basel III, it's quite different. That one, Basel III, there is no provision of regular dividend if a bank is making losses. There is no provision. There is a provision for write-off if a bank reaches its CET1 ratio, below a threshold. Thirdly, there is also a provision that at the time of the call date, right, after let's say 5 years, a bank has to approach RBI and they should be able to assess that they are getting a better quality capital than they have currently. So even the call date is not assured that after 5 years a bond will be called. So a good probability is there that a bond should be called, but yet it's nowhere there. Secondly, unlike Basel II, there is no step up, right? So even if, let's say, the bank does not call, there is no cost to the bank of not calling the bond. So the only thing which I see is obviously these 81, the full capital write-offs, which we saw in one of the 81s recently, that usually happens only in case of a bankruptcy. So as long as you are not seeing, bankruptcy in a bank, obviously that principal write-off is a remote possibility. But one should not compare fixed deposits with a 81 firstly, and one should be aware of these risks that, okay, after 5 years, that this bond could not be called. Within these 5 years, there could be a possibility that a coupon may be skipped, right? So as long as one is aware and one says, okay, I'm okay with 1 year of coupon skipping, or let's say after 5 years, instead of, let's say, it gets called in 6th year or 7th year, I'm okay with that. Then it's obviously investor can do that. But like I said, it should not be a binary allocation. It should only be a part of allocation. So what happens usually, and what we saw in demonetization, right? That's when the perfect example, because when AAA yields went down to 6%, that's where most of the misallocation happened to credit funds. So if you remember, credit funds were about 30,000 crores before demonetization. They went to 1.3 lakh crores. And that is just credit and medium term fund. The other low duration, ultra short, which were credit oriented, also grew rapidly after demon. So these are the worst times when misallocation happens. So one should be true to their fixed income framework, that majority of your allocation should be to the core bucket. You can, if you have that risk appetite, please allocate, but it should be somewhere between 20-25% of your total fixed income allocation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mittal, for taking the questions. Now over to Kaushal for taking this with you. Thanks.
Thanks, Sridhar. I would like to take some time for vote of thanks. Good evening, all. As all the good things come to an end, so does this webinar. On behalf of Way2Wealth, I take this opportunity to propose a vote of thanks to our speaker, Mr. Anurag Mittal. We are sure his thoughts on topics like ill movements in the fixed income markets, RBI's accommodative stance, inflation outlook, and liquidity surplus would have provided some requisite information to our esteemed participants on the debt market. I also thank our participants for their valuable time to hear us out. Thank you, IDFC AMC and our team at Way2Wealth to help us conduct this event. Our partner, Mr. Rajesh Khemani of Messrs Blossom Advisors and Consultants, have been actively supporting us for the conduct of this webinar. Blossom Advisors and Consultants Private Limited is a 5-year young boutique debt syndication firm with focus on supply chain finance and structured trade finance. It is run by finance professionals with principle of deep roots and strong branches. Our next webinar, as part of our Way2Wealth's ongoing webinar series on the BFSI segment, is on credit insurance. It is scheduled on coming Wednesday, that is 16th of September 2020, from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. The speaker is Mr. Shantanu Pathak, who is the CIO and Senior Vice President at Raheja QBE General Insurance Company Limited. We will be shortly mailing you the YouTube link of this webinar along with the survey form for your valuable comments. Thank you all once again.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mr. Anurag Mittal, for your kind words and guidance to our participants on the same. I'll leave it now on to host Mr. Shantanu.
Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Anurag. Have a very good evening.